Okay, you're live. Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome from SCoT, Smart Community Tourism Webinar Series. We are with you today with volume 28, and we're going to invite our curator, the architect of SCoT webinars, Professor Jafar Jafari, to enlighten us with opening remark, and I'll be back to you shortly after Professor Jafari's opening remark to introduce our moderator and the program for today. Professor Jafari, floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and good day to everybody. Thanks very much for joining the webinar. Those of you have been with us before on different volumes, different episodes. You know that at the beginning, either I or Kazim or Duarte or other colleague would tell you about the series in general, the purpose of the series. And that's exactly what I'm going to do now. The subject of the webinar is something that Mozo is going to handle. We decided to start this series because very limited attention was given to small communities in tourism. Very little attention was given to small operators or small and medium-sized operators. And especially this became more evident during the COVID-19. The big companies, the big destinations, the big airlines, the big hotel chains, they knew where to go for help. They knew how to scream. They knew how to get attention. The little ones didn't know where to go, what to do, what questions to ask, from whom to ask the question, what to do in the meantime. So we decided to respond to the forgotten voices and faces, or they are not very much present on the scene as you have already experienced. If you review the webinars you have attended yourself so far, it is always about the big issues in tourism, including over-tourism, popular destinations, etc., etc. So we do little things for little companies, and hopefully that goes a few extra miles. The topic of today is excellent, as something that it should be in the core of any subject. I thank Mozo for popularizing, Mozo and a few other colleagues for popularizing and populating the tourism field with this subject. The book that they did some 5 years ago, I believe, was one of the milestones in the field of tourism, bringing quality of life and associating that with quality of life for the community as well as for the host. And I'm pretty sure today we will be talking about quality of life, both for host and guest. And this is very important. Those of you have seen some of my past presentations. I came up with a slogan about 10 years ago. It hasn't gone worldwide yet. A nice place to visit is a nice place to live, or vice versa. A nice place to live is a nice place to visit. And I try to associate these two together. I cannot think of any destination that people are miserable and tourism is blooming. It can't happen. You know, one would hurt the other one. And the purpose of tourism is, after all, to help the communities, whether it's small or large. And of course, we are dealing with the small communities. I don't want to say more because I'm here also, Mozo, to listen to you and to your panel with expertise in this subject. It's a very exciting topic. Thank you very much for posing this topic. And thank you very much for your panel. And the microphone is yours, Moza.
Thank you, Jafar, for your great remarks. And as Jafar said, I am Muzo Uysal, Professor and Chair of the Department of Hospitality and Tourism Management, Heisenberg School of Management at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. And it is really wonderful to know that you are joining us from different parts of the world. Wherever you might be, I would say good morning to those of us who are in the USA, those of you who are in Europe, good afternoon, and some other places, and good evening to you all. And we're delighted that you could join us. As Kazim and Jafar mentioned, the focus of this panel is part of SCoT, Smart Community Tourism Webinars, is quality of life, well-being of the host community. And this is an area of research that has gained much attention. So first, let me take this moment to thank again the creator of the Smart Community Tourism webinar series, Professor Jafar Jafari. This is a fantastic service that's been going on for a while, and also the creator, Professor Kazim Rohadare, for giving us the opportunity to organize this and moderate this panel. And also your admin, Harad, I guess we thank her as well. So over the past 20 years or so, we have seen much more research being conducted in tourism and quality of life. And this area of research has blossomed, growing over the years to the point that it is now well recognized to be an important subject matter in tourism hospitality discipline. So the scope and range of issues suggest that the topic of well-being, life satisfaction, quality of life research in tourism hospitality is multidimensional, highly complex, and poses challenges and new opportunities for academics and practitioners at all levels, whether it be you're talking about at the individual level, community level, or as a destination. So this panel that we organized today is created to explore the nature of the reciprocal link between tourism development and quality of life, and hopefully offer some practical solutions, as Jafar alluded to, for communities as destinations, and maybe some guidelines and perhaps future directions for communities as destinations that may be seeking to further develop their tourism potential to either maintain their market share or sustain their tourism activities without, this is important, impinging on the well-being of different stakeholders within that community. This is so important. Within this reality, we as researchers and practitioners are also challenged to continue engaging in meaningful research, examining some aspect of well-being and quality of life research. Just like in information technology, as Jafar alluded to, quality of life research also cut across almost everything we do. As you know, we have probably looked at the website. We have 4 outstanding panelists. And I'm so happy that they all agreed to be part of this panel. And these people are extremely busy and their time is very precious. Professor Joe Sergi, Professor Gibson, Professor Cross, and Professor Kruger. I thank them all for being with us on this panel. I am sure these panelists will be happy to hear from you after our, I guess, discussion and dialogue. If you were to reach out to any of these panelists, they will be delighted to get back to you because it looks like we have so many participants from different parts of the world. We hope that the panel will inspire us and maybe help us to engage in this line of research from your own area of expertise. The scope and range of possible topics is enormous in this field. That being said, now you have probably looked at their bios and who these individuals are. I don't think they really need specific introduction, but let's start the panel discussion, I guess, at least. Let me tell you a little bit about the structure. First, we'd like our panelists just maybe give us, share with us like 5-6 minutes of their time to focus on the things that they like to share with us, because they all have different expertise within this quality of life research. So we would love to start off with Professor Joe Sergio, who's been probably one of the well-established, well-known thinker, leader, researcher in the area of quality of life worldwide. I mean, the words that I could have come up would not be sufficient to express or to explain his contribution, and he's the kind of person who could be so contagious. He's the one who got me into this quality of life research at Virginia Tech when I was there. But it is a great pleasure, Joe, to have you here, and I'm humbled and honored. This goes to you all, to really have you as members of this panel. And then I'm going to turn the floor over to you, Joe, and then take maybe 5-7 minutes or so. Then Joe will be followed by Heather Gibson, Professor Gibson, then Professor Tycho Kroos, and finally Professor Stefan Kruger. Would that sound good to us now, rather than just spending a lot of time on bios? But I think you will be able to read all that, but these are just fantastic people to be part of. Joe, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Muzo, for this introduction, and hello, everyone. As you can see from this slide, I was asked to sort of set the stage by focusing on discussing the quality of life theory or the psychology of well-being in the context of community quality of life, especially in the context of travel and tourism. So again, we're focusing on host communities and the extent to which residents within a host community can or are likely to experience a high level of well-being as a function of tourism development within that community. So the theory that seems to dominate this kind of research over the years is called bottom-up spillover theory of life satisfaction, as you can see from this slide. And the slide—
Joseph, would you share this slide, please?
Oh, I thought the okay, I'm sorry. For some reason I thought it was already up and running.
Perfect.
Okay, as you can see from this slide, the theory that has sort of dominated the research in this area in travel and tourism is called bottom-up spillover theory of life satisfaction. And this figure shows the sort of the psychology behind it. And the psychology behind it, much of the research has sort of focused on life satisfaction. And in this context, we're talking about life satisfaction of residents of host communities, people that live in the community, and the extent to which they feel satisfied with their lives. And ultimately, what we want to do is we want to connect the kinds of experiences associated with travel and tourism in the context of that community and the extent to which it feeds to life satisfaction. So as you see from this pyramid, life satisfaction is very much influenced by satisfaction in life domains. So when we talk about life domains, we're talking about things like, if I were to ask you, how do you feel about your social life? How do you feel about your work life? How do you feel about your community life? How do you feel about your leisure life? These are different life domains that are sort of embedded and segmented within the minds of community residents, and the satisfaction that is sort of invested in those different life domains influence, the life satisfaction judgment. The life satisfaction judgment is, if I were to ask a person, how do you feel about your life at large, as a whole? So people, what they do is, psychologically speaking, is they focus on how they feel in the context of specific life domains, social life, family life, work life, leisure life, community life. And what they do is, the life satisfaction judgment is very much influenced by the positive and negative feelings that they have, or sort of invested in those different life domains. So as you can see from this figure, satisfaction with life domains influences life satisfaction at large. So the challenge then, in the context of a community and residents that reside, that live in the host community, is how do experiences related to travel and tourism within that community affects satisfaction with life domains. So let's say if a person lives in a community that has some sort of an attraction, whatever the attraction is, let's say maybe a water park. Okay, well, the extent to which the water park influences his or her satisfaction in, let's say, maybe leisure domain, in social life, in family life, it's very likely that, again, such an attraction in the host community is likely to kind of spill over and generate positive or negative feelings, depending on exactly how things go about. And these affective experiences related to specific life events in the context of the host community spills over into these life domains, ultimately affecting how people feel satisfied with their lives at large. So this is the sort of the gist of the theory that has sort of dominated this kind of research. These are two references that can, for those people who are interested in reading a little bit more about it, then you may be able to, again, do a little bit more reading about this. But in essence, what we're looking at, how does tourism in a community influence community residents' quality of life? This is another figure that really shows you how it does that. And this is, again, based on the research that we've conducted. Actually, Muzo and I have done this together, again, with other people. So the idea then is life satisfaction is very much influenced by the sense of material well-being, social well-being, the sense of cultural well-being, and the sense of environmental well-being, again, embedded in that in the context of that community, and the perception, how they perceive tourism economic impact and tourism social impact, tourism cultural impact, tourism environmental impact. These things, these perceptions affect their sense of material well-being, it's their social well-being, their cultural well-being, their environmental well-being. And this influence of what's happening in the community and the way it affects those specific life domains is very much moderated by what we call tourism development cycle. And the tourism development cycle is whether, again, those attraction sites or whatever the tourism types of services that are provided within this community tend to be new or tend to be well established. So we're talking about a development cycle. So this is the sort of the model that has dominated the research in that area. And if you can sort of understand or appreciate this model and the research behind it, you'd be able to, again, better appreciate, what we're talking about in terms of the extent to which residents can feel satisfied with their lives as a function of what's happening with travel and tourism embedded in that community, or at least contextualized as such. Okay, well, on that note, I'm going to turn it over back to Muzo, because I think, that is the theoretical base of which we can understand how tourism affects quality of life for residents in a community setting. Muzo?
Thank you, Joe. Just before we move on to the second panelist, there has been some confusion in terms of different terms that people use in this line of research. What do we mean, for example, when we say psychological happiness, like hedonic versus, let's say, we talk about, prudential happiness, life satisfaction, even eudaimonic, whatever, satisfaction. So, without getting into too much detail, could you just shed some light on all this in terms of philosophical foundation of this concept, and what do they represent, or how do they overlap in general?
Okay, sure, and a good question, and that may help the audience better understand exactly what we've been doing in terms of quality of life and the psychology of well-being. So in the psychology of well-being, much of the research has sort of distinguished three major concepts associated with the concept of well-being. So again, if we're talking about the well-being of community residents, in that sense, life satisfaction seems to be a major concept. So when we ask, how do you feel about your life at large? Then that is a major concept of what we call the psychology of well-being. The other one is what we call, what Muzo has made reference to, and that is hedonic well-being. And that is a little bit more a concept which is sort of at a micro level. It's much more can be construed at an emotional level. And in that context, we talk about a preponderance of positive versus negative affect or negative feelings. So a person who's experienced something within the community related to travel and tourism, as a resident, if that person feels a preponderance of positive feelings, positive emotions, vis-a-vis negative emotions, then we can say that that person has been the tourism component has influenced the quality of life or the well-being of that person in a positive way. If there is more positive emotions than negative emotion as a function of those travel and tourism experiences that are embedded in that community. The third concept is a little bit more a macro level concept, a developmental type of concept, which is based on what we call eudaimonia. It's sort of a Greek term that really goes back all the way to the times of Aristotle, the Greek philosopher. And it deals with not only happiness, It doesn't deal with just positive and negative emotions. It focuses on the good life. So a person who's experiencing the good life is a person who is satisfied with his life, is a person who experiences a preponderance of positive emotions vis-a-vis negative emotions, but also is a little bit more psychologically developed, socially developed, emotionally developed, and morally developed. So we're talking about a good person. So much of the quality of life research, at least the psychology part of it, tends to focus nowadays on not just happiness per se, but how does travel and tourism contributes to a eudaimonic type of experience, a well-being type of experience that helps the person develop psychologically, emotionally, socially, morally, that kind of thing. So again, these are three major concepts that have now has sort of dominated the academic literature on the psychology of well-being.
Thank you, Joe. I'm sure later on our audience will have some question on this, but just to mention, Joe, of course, has over 30 books in this area, and if you want to know some of this in detail, and I'm not promoting his latest book or edition, but there is that book, The Psychology of Quality of Life. I think now just came out, the updated new version of it. That's a leading book in this area, and you're welcome to take a look at it, published by Springer. Thank you, Joe. This is wonderful. And now we can move on to our second panelist, and Professor Heather Gibson. She is also well-established, and everyone in leisure tourism research will know her research and her contribution. Her research interests include sport tourism, specializing in sport events and active sport, tourism, and the way she looks at maybe quality of life, well-being would be from her own research perspective, event-based, event tourism, or event communities, etc. So again, hopefully you took a look at her resume, and we're so happy, Heather, to have you as part of this panel. And thank you for your contribution to the field and your successes. You're an outstanding, scholar, one of the leading scholars in leisure recreation. So the floor is all yours, Heather.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much. I'm very, very pleased to join this panel today. Professor Fari is probably actually quite surprised I'm not going to be talking about the tourist, because that's been very much the focus of my career. And Professor Sergi, your ideas about eudaimonia, absolutely, because coming out of a leisure studies background, the whole idea of leisure and its contribution to the good life is very much where we've been. But I feel I've got two perspectives on quality of life. One is, as I said, definitely on that participant, the tourist, and what makes life meaningful, particularly through those concepts of life satisfaction and well-being. But in terms of today, particularly with the focus on community, I feel that my work on sport event tourism has been where we really look at the ideas of community development and also well-being. And I see this as part of the overall umbrella of social impacts of event hosting. So coming out of that tradition as a sociologist, looking at tourism from the early days of positive and negative, actually, if you look at the tourism literature, we have quite a tradition of looking at these mega events in particular from this tradition of resident impact studies. So go back into tourism management, go back into JTR, go back into annals, and you'll see 20 years of event studies that weren't called events back then. They were really focused on this tradition of hosting these big events. What does it mean in terms of that tradition of resident impact studies for concepts such as the quality of life of communities. And certainly in the work that I've done with my colleagues, for example, we had a big project on the FIFA World Cup in 2010 in South Africa. I was very much inspired at the time by the movie Invictus and the way that hosting these sport events can be used for the social good. So thinking about what Professor Sergi has talked about in terms of social impacts of as a dimension of quality of life, we were very much interested in not just looking at quality of life, which we actually did measure in terms of event hosting, but also a concept that had been developing through tourism studies, really very much in Brent Ritchie's work in terms of events going all the way back to the 80s, where he starts talking about this psychological concept of hosting events in terms of psychic income. So we know, for example, hosting an event means that the community is very excited. There's an enhanced pride, there's an enhanced patriotism. But also, we're starting to think about in those early days of the 2000s, how can events actually be used for the social good of the community? And again, coming out of leisure studies, the concept of social capital as a social impact of doing something. So how do we bring a community together in terms of hosting this event? So that's really what we've been focusing on. As I said, certainly in the early days of these mega events. And what we found was psychic income, absolutely, in a pre-post event design, did increase and actually stayed. And I know researchers that have looked at the 2012 London Olympics also found that. But when it came down to long-term change, so this idea of creating a much more trustworthy, bonded society, that it just didn't occur. And so this is where we really then need to think about when we host events, we can't just host an event and hope things happen. We've actually got to go back to a concept that Lawrence Chalip has been championing in the field since the Sydney Olympics, which is the idea of leveraging. So how do we set the goals in the pre-event stage and then actively manage them so that these goals then are actually achieved during phase of the hosting event, but very much in the post-event phase. And in the field right now, this, certainly the big question is, whose responsibility is it to actively leverage these outcomes? Because if you talk to the event planners and managers, they're busy. They're busy getting the event ready. There's so many dynamics in terms of hosting these big events now that they're busy. So whose responsibility is it? Which stakeholder groups are responsible for actively leveraging outcomes? And really, are we, and this goes back to some of the tourism development research that you're going to hear about, is an event just a catalyst for change within a community? That it can't do it all by itself. And so this idea, just as we talked about in tourism studies, that tourism is part of the wider community. And so therefore, we've got to look at tourism in relation to the wider community and other things that are happening. And so for me, yes, we all get so excited. We just had another Olympics and it was great to see all the achievements of the athletes. But the sociologist in me has still got major critiques about these mega events, and particularly through some of the work that we've actually done where these long-term benefits are still elusive as it relates to the social impacts for the communities. So I see what's happening in communities, particularly at the smaller scale level, within that idea that community is involved in these events, where we have much more opportunity to look at both the tangible and intangible benefits for communities, particularly the social impact. Because what we've done is focus on economics without really looking at what it means for the well-being of the community, what it means for social capital within a community. But I've also got some concerns I see that many of the communities, I see it certainly in the state of Florida, but beyond, particularly on the focus of hosting sporting events at these community levels, like the youth sport events, for example, are too many communities vying for the same goal. And so we're getting a little bit into event cannibalism, where communities are coming up against each other. We also need to think about the quality of life of the communities in terms of event hosting, where if we host too many events over too many weekends, there's a lot of disruption for the communities often. Traffic flows, for example, if we close down the roads consistently for a marathon, they get angry after a while, which goes back to some of our early days within tourism of the negative impacts on the quality of life. So let's start thinking in terms of event portfolios where we have a master plan within the community where events are managed by the calendar, managed by the different impacts on the host communities. And then a growing academic concern I have, because I sit in the field of sport management as well, is there's a lot of sport event research going on that has nothing to do with tourism anymore. They've kind of ignored the tourism, and we can't do that because, as we know from tourism researchers, tourism is a major part of these events. It's a major part of why the events are successful, why the events have these benefits for the community in terms of quality of life. So that's something that I think we really need to keep our eyes on. And then there's still too much focus in the event field on the legacies without the leveraging. So what I talked about before, you can't just host an event and hope things will happen in terms of the overall quality of life of the community. You've got to leverage it. And this goes back to the old days in terms of community tourism planning kind of lessons, that the community needs to be actively involved in this and to take a part in this, whether it's through volunteering, whether it's through attending, but it has to be active involvement. So my overall question to finish, certainly within the event field, particularly as it relates to the impacts on host communities, is how can hosting events be leveraged to promote quality of life amongst the residents? So thank you very much, everybody. And I'm looking forward to hearing what the other panelists say so that we can get a wider conversation going. So thank you.
Hopefully we can visit that question you raised, Heather, very timely. I think we will come back to it. Thank you. Thank you so much for your great points and your own observations. I wonder, because you have also done good research, one of your projects focused on girlfriend travel. I mean, you know, you have done a lot, and that was probably one of the really great projects we've seen recently, focusing on, let's say, women travel. And, you know, we don't really see gender perspective in our research as much, but did that project have some relevance to our current discussion? If you could just—
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I really need to recognize the research team on that one. Lisa Berdachevsky, who was one of my current students at the time, now an associate professor at the University of Illinois in tourism, and then Heather Bell, another one of my PhD students at the time. And we really were, if we think back to Professor Sergey's talk about eudaimonia and the idea of looking at the individual micro level well-being through tourism. And that's, you know, a lot of that focus has been throughout my research through time, particularly on the early days of solo women's travel, and then particularly in the girlfriend getaways. So these all-female travel groups and what it means. And what has been really interesting, particularly as a associate editor for Annals, is how this girlfriend getaways research has really been expanding, particularly through a lot of researchers on the Asian continent. So now we're starting to see a lot of focus on a sociocultural difference in what it means from the Western perspective, where we've been, Catherine Kulanama's work on, she started much more on a quantitative focus on girlfriend getaways. And then more recently, we've seen some young scholars from various Asian countries where they've been giving us much more of that focus on, for example, Chinese women and the kind of influence of Confucianism, the influence of the different philosophies on the well-being. So it's quite exciting, as you said, to actually look at what's going on now and how, and it really works well in research where people build from, and they built from your work, looking at the foundations of quality of life. So how do we use the research that's gone before and then build on that? And I think that's a lesson for some of the younger scholars that we see in the panel today, that research science is about, it's like building a brick wall. If you go back to Foster's work on, chaos in the brickyard, that we've really got to look at building from the concept. So Professor Sergey, your kind of theoretical foundation is exactly how I work. And that's how I train my PhD students. And that's what we need to be as a field, so that we build forwards and we build from the early days up. When I hear people say, oh, don't cite anything before the year 2000, I go crazy, because, so much of my work goes back to Cohen in 1972. And it's still very relevant. Maslow, 1943, still very relevant. So absolutely. So I'll shut up now and give some of the others a chance to speak.
Thank you, Heather. Our third panelist, Professor Robertica Cruz, comes from the University of Central Florida. I've known Tuco for a long time. He's an amazing person, of course, well-established, and by training, he's an economist, but he has done so much in the area of how, the connection between economics of tourism and how, tourism may help us elevate, let's say, poverty. But the beauty of his research is this to me, even if he gets into sustainability, competitiveness, but he has done real field, studies in several micro states and small states, and he has also done outstanding consulting with different places and countries. I think there isn't any other person who does the kind of research, we see in our field, like be a trained economist. And at a young age, he was in politics. Once upon a time, I remember, I think he served as almost Minister of Finance for Aruba once upon a time. And, he's the youngest person. You look at him, and a handsome person. But anyway, I think we look forward to, hearing your perspective on your research, and from the perspective of, I guess, the connection you have established between, economics and well-being in several small macro states and small communities. So really a pleasure to see you here and to have you back again with us. The floor is yours. You can go ahead and take 5 to 7 minutes and see where we go from there. Thank you, Tuco.
Thank you, Muzo. Welcome, everybody. I would like to start by saying that the premise from which I look at quality of life is that the pursuit of happiness is the ultimate goal of public policy. So that was my departure point. And I focus on residents. So I don't focus on the tourists, but I focus on what is the impact specifically on residents. So the question that I have asked is not so much in terms of how tourism has impacted the community from your perspective, but how tourism has impacted you as an individual. So that's very important to establish from the beginning. And then the third important element of the scope of my research is I base also on the focus on eudaimonia. So I looked at the capability approach, SAN. So that's where I started with my research. And that started about 15 years ago. So that's important to begin with. The last point that I want to make at the beginning is also I looked very much at the external validity of the relation between tourism development and well-being. And over those 15 years, I looked at 3 different countries. One, islands. The second is developing countries, particularly in Latin America. And the third one, which I started about 3 years ago, is I'm looking at transition economies, particularly in Eastern Europe. So from those 3 groups of countries, we established a pretty good sense of what's going on, at least the lessons that we have learned. And of course, all this research has been done with a team of researchers from different countries and also from the Rosen College at the University of Central Florida. And where we started was initially to look at the objective well-being, so from the capability approach. And we started with poor countries, looking at how, for example, the Human Development Index was more or less impacted by tourism development. But as we started to look more into the HDI, what we learned is that we start talking to the poor people, that there is a disconnect between their experience and, for example, the HDI. And it's not for nothing that, for example, when you look at the Gallup polls, that Paraguay is the happiest country in the world, while being the poorest country, or one of the poorest countries in Latin America. So that is very interesting. That made us move looking more towards the subjective well-being and together with the objective well-being. So what did we learn over the years? We learned that happiness and life satisfaction are pretty much stable in island economy, and I will expand a little bit about that. The second thing that we learned is that in developing countries, and I'm talking here specifically about Latin America, we discovered a poverty paradox. The poor seems more satisfied with their life than being happy people. So that's very important. And then in the transition countries where we started to look at, people seem happier than satisfied with their life. So there are three different types of basically results of the impact of tourism development on people in general. And also that the causality relationship, the positive relationship between tourism development and well-being explains very little in the variance, 10% or less, which means that there are 90% or more that is explained by other factors, which is very important. And that the relationship is also diminishing over time, so it's polynomial. So it's not stable, but as the destinations or the countries move up the ladder in terms of the tourism development cycle, the relationship tends to be less clear. There are intervening variables that affect that increase the well-being barriers. For example, in terms of mediator, we found that both the individual treadmill and the social treadmill are very, very important, that increase that. By individual treadmill, I mean when you compare yourself with, you compare your past with your present, and opportunities in the future, and the type of adaptation that is known in what Professor Sergi referred in several of his works. And there is a social treadmill, that there's a social comparison that we have found very prominent as you move up the ladder in terms of the tourism development cycle. And then the moderators are also important. And the moderators are basically two things: opportunities, and then who gets what. For example, Dr. Gibson mentioned the community. Sometimes when you talk to leaders, we found very often you talk to leaders in tourism, they think the benefits are great, but then you talk to people, there is a complete disconnect between the two. And we found that in all three different types of countries, which seems very relevant when you look at how you have to gauge actually the impact of tourism overall. And then there are differences between the subjective well-being and the objective well-being, as we said, and the overlap depends a lot on the tourism development cycle. So the more mature you are, the closer they are together. The less mature you are, the farther away they are from each other. We also found the Easterlin paradox, which is the connection between income and subjective well-being. It's not self-evident in the sense that a lot of, especially in poor countries, if you're below a certain material level, consumption level, we see very clearly that they look more and how much they get. But as soon as you move beyond that, for example, we look at the quintiles of several developing countries, and we have seen that quintile 4 and 5 are the ones where there is no clear connection between income and subjective well-being. Social and individual treadmills are critical in well-being. And in terms of policy, we need to assess, how close this overlap is between subjective well-being and objective well-being, because it has different policy consequences, which is very, very important. And then also how far the social and the individual treadmills are from each other, because one would have, if you're looking at the social well-being where social comparison is very crucial, then of course distribution of the benefits are important. If it's more adaptation, then, for example, public policy should focus more on increasing income levels. So these are some of the things that we have found, and I just wanted to share it very, very quickly with you. And if you have any questions, I will gladly try to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you. And then just for those of you who are tuning in to listen to this panelist, Touko's recent work has been all over. If you take a look at our, reputable journals such as Tourism Management, Journal of Travel Research, Tourism Economics, you will see some of the things that he's talking about. Touko, I just wanted to have, I'm sure we will have more questions, but this is so exciting. Just based on these three types of countries you have been studying, so if you were to identify, let's say, one or two features that may be common to all versus like what drives, let's say, the direction of a transitional, type economy or country versus, let's say, more of an, established or island nation. If you could just kind of delineate a couple of those like challenges or what you face in those specific categories, if you may.
What is very crucial is the development, the tourism development cycle, as Professor Sergi mentioned before. So because that's the way how you will see it. If I look at a mature small island, they can, the residents can identify from the get-go that these are factors that are due to tourism. If I look at the transition country where tourism, moving from social tourism to more market tourism, they still cannot see that particular difference. So I would say that I would look more at the second part, very clearly the factors that impact well-being instead of just talking about tourism development. From a methodological perspective, one could say whether you will use tourism development as a second order or first order in order to, measure that particular impact, that, to say it very clearly. So that is one of them. And the other thing is, as you move as well through the cycle, you can see that social comparison, so the social treadmill, becomes more and more relevant as you move on. So what does it mean in terms of for example, public policy? It's again the distribution of the benefits. And so therefore, if tourism has anything to do, and that's the third thing that we learn, and which is very similar, is not so much in terms of the jobs, but it is, especially in the objective field, is how public policy uses those income, in order to focus really on what it matters, which is human development, which is education and health. Because those, especially in poor countries, what we learn is in terms of what is the hierarchy of things that they really care about. It is the physical part, which is health, is number one. And number second is the social functionings, which is being connected with the family, being connected with the community, and so on. So for example, money is very low on that ranking if you compare what is crucial in terms of, people at the bottom of the society ladder.
Thank you. Fantastic. I think as brought up by Heather and Joe and by you, I think we will visit a couple of these issues in terms of maybe implications like developing public policy. That's one area, and measurement, and that was also brought up in the chat. And maybe we can also address a little bit the differences between, let's say, subjective versus objective quality of life indicators, and how do they overlap and what do they mean. So there's a lot about methodology and methodological issues, measurement issues when you think about, you know, the typical constructs we deal with, whether it be, you know, life satisfaction in general, or types of, you know, well-being measures, etc. I think hopefully we'll come back to all this and maybe hear from each of you. Thank you. Our fourth panelist, another well-established quality of life scholars, and he comes from South Africa, the Northwest University, and Professor Stefan Kruger has been looking at the quality of life studies as an outcome in different hospitality and tourism settings for a long time, and very active researcher, leading researcher, and we're so happy that you can join us. I don't know the time there, Stefan. It is in the evening now in South Africa?
It's 16:25 p.m., 4:30 p.m.
Excellent. So
Thank
the
you,
floor
guys.
is for you.
Thank you, Muzo. My main research actually focus on consumptive-related research examples such as travel motives, life domains, and then the subjective indicators of quality of life. However, I would like to start sharing my screen with you guys, and that because research on residents residing in tourism-host communities also received attention. Well, our beautiful country, South Africa. Due to tourism growth in South Africa, even now with COVID-19, it is evident that more local host communities experiencing the impacts of tourism and development in providing quality tourism experiences. Tourism development and experience bring about positive and negative impacts as per Joe's model. I'm from a point of view that these impacts have a direct influence on residents of a tourism host community, affecting their quality of life positively. Once a host community becomes a tourist destination, their lives are affected by tourism development. However, it seems that the positive impacts outweigh the negative impacts. Even differentiating between a permanent tourism product, for example, influx of tourists on an ongoing basis to a tourism destination, or a non-permanent tourism product, for example, residents hosting a once-off event annually, or residents residing close or further away from tourism activity. There is consensus in support for tourism development in improving these host communities' quality of life. In terms of life domains, we found that residents of tourism host communities experiencing also more positive effect than negative effect in their life domains, which have a direct positive spillover effect, like the bottom-up spillover theory, on their quality of life due to benefits derived from tourism. However, some sort of negative effect that I need to mention is that communities are concerned with crime rate, especially when an event takes place or where there's high activity, tourism-related activity. This is what I would like to talk about also is quality of life is known as a multidimensional concept and is differently understood by individuals, researchers, and residents of host tourism communities. Quality of life is synonymously associated with concepts such as life quality, life satisfaction, or satisfaction with life, well-being, and happiness. And the challenge comes here actually with the concept life satisfaction or satisfaction with life, and that a great scholar, Prof. Ed Diener, the late Prof. Ed Diener, refers to satisfaction with life. And then when you review papers and that, you tend to find that many refer to life satisfaction. So which is the correct concept then? Therefore, does one capture because I've noticed that many quality of life researchers actually functioning or working on the subjective nature of quality of life. And does one then capture quality of life as a whole, or do we measure just the subjective indicator of quality of life? Key buzzwords that come to mind that will have a direct influence on residents of tourism house communities' quality of life, and it has been researched, is sustainability. Of course, is preservation of the natural environment, carbon footprint, competitiveness, slow food, individuals actually providing their own food products and serve that to tourists visiting them. The fourth industrial revolution that's taking momentum and is shaping currently, and that actually with all the high-tech IT stuff that are used, how does that influence actually the communities? Is there support there for co-creation, quality services, smart tourism communities, eco-friendliness, safety, slow tourism, meaning that tourists staying longer in a community, intersectional environmentalism, and going green. So my question is actually, how do we effectively communicate, inform host communities of a tourism destination about the benefits brought on by tourism development to their quality of life? Because it seems like you're getting somebody that actually approves your research, and you do technical reports to tourism planners as such and that, but does that actually getting communicated to the residents who reside in these tourism host communities? Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. I was just thinking about Tico's presentation, policy implications. I think you really posed a fantastic questions, right? How do you effectively communicate the benefits of tourism development? And then if we move this on to the next level, so we're really talking about, developing some sort of a policy which we can use to justify our existence and makes that connection between development and, let's say, well-being of different stakeholders, right? That's the key thing, regardless of whether you are part of the consumption and production system of tourism goods and services. So meaning, even if you don't have anything to do with it, you can still, as Jafar said, benefit from the consequences of this development. And that could be a good policy discussion, or justification to share with different legislators, right? And so a good place is a good place to visit, or what was it, the phrase you said, Jafar? And a nice, destination could be a good place to live, right? So that argument, to me is so powerful, but at the same time, let's say it becomes inclusive in the sense that, we bring others who may not have anything to do with tourism could still benefit from the consequences of development. So that's the kind of, connection we're trying to establish when we say well-being of, stakeholders, regardless of how you may be defined as a stakeholder, whether it be, a citizen or just community or whoever or organizer. Okay, so, and yet I just live there as a retiree, I should benefit as much because as a result of tourism development, we have now more green space and more benches in the park. So therefore, all that, will somehow contribute to our well-being. I guess I love that question, how you formulate it. So it's kind of an open-ended question, but it has tremendous policy implications in the end. What is it that we can bring to those legislators, right? And how do you then convince locals to really express support for an event or tourism development? You see, if we make that connection, right, so strong, then we will be able to gain more support, not because I'm affected by tourism, therefore my livelihood depends on it, so therefore I just support. But the idea is, even if your livelihood does not depend on that, in that community, you should still be able to benefit, right? Some, therefore, that quality of life connection goes a long way in terms of, policy implication. And thank you for really posing that question. I'm pretty sure we will come back to it again. Well, at this time, I guess, looking at our program, Kazim, is there anything else you suggest us to do? Or are we taking a little break? Then we come back to this discussion Q&A session.
Thank you, Muzo, Professor Uysal, as it was expected from you. Very punctual and very informative panel. I'm just taking a lot of memo myself, and we have a lot of questions in the panel. Before that, I just want to mention that Dr. Uysal has an extensive experience in tourism and hospitality field. He has worked on several funded projects and conducted workshops and seminars in several countries. He is a recipient of several research and teaching awards and member of the International Academy for the Study of Tourism, the Academy of Leisure Science, and the Hospitality and Tourism Management Academy. His current research interests focus on development and quality of life research in tourism and hospitality setting. Thanks, Muzo. If you agree, we go with a cultural break, as it is the custom of SCoT, while our audience can grab their coffee and they move their body a bit. We come back with the panel discussion. So let me go with the video link. Please let me know if it's working well. Do we have the sound? Maybe not. No sound. Just a moment. Yes, there we go.
I grew up thinking that the definition of quality of life, to have a high quality of life, that meant having a nice house, a nice car, and boundless comforts. But I traveled the world and went to places where there were no comforts whatsoever, and it seemed like the people were much happier. I myself would go camping and backpacking and doing all kinds of strenuous things with no comforts whatsoever. And yet I found the quality of my life was greatly enhanced by doing these types of activities. And that's when I realized that quality of life really has nothing to do with material possessions whatsoever. True quality of life has a very simple definition. Quality of life is directly proportional to the quality of how we spend our time. Those that have the best lives are the ones that spend the highest proportion of their time doing what they love in proportion to the amount of time they spend doing things that they don't love or that they find boring and mundane. You have to take control of your time. You have to start spending your time doing what fulfills you, learning, practicing certain skills that you want to become proficient at, going on adventures and seeing new things, new people, new places. These are the kind of things that give us true quality of life. And some of the wealthiest people I know have the poorest quality of life of anyone I have ever met. Their time is completely consumed by things that they do not like doing. Completely consumed by things that they don't really deeply care about. If you want to have a great life, it does not matter how much money you have. All that matters is how you spend your time. Money can be used to free up time. You can buy some freedom with which to spend your time with money, but so few people actually use money to do that. And you don't need money to do that. Start with an hour a day spent doing something that truly fulfills you, and then go to 2 and then 3, and then hopefully you find a way where you are getting paid well to do something that you love, and get to the point where your life is consumed completely by activities that you inherently enjoy. If you get there, you'll see your quality of life is far better than it once was, and it has absolutely nothing to do with your bank account. Stop projecting a better life for yourself into the future. Start spending your time doing what you love now. And don't ever settle for a life that is full of boring, mundane tasks that you don't like to do.
Thank you very much, and welcome back again. I hope everybody had a bit of time to refresh. I just grabbed my coffee. I don't know what time is in your local, and we are ready to go with the question and answer. Before that, I want to mention that we in SCoT team receive emails from you guys about the videos and recording of this webinars. All are ready in about 12 hours after the webinar and accessible from our YouTube channel. I would like to ask our admin people to send the link, please, to the chat. Yes, you can see the YouTube channel in the chat. Maybe it's better if you just click on that and subscribe the channel, and automatically when the videos are uploaded to the channel, it comes with a notification to you, and you have the answer to the question that you ask us. Thank you very much. So I would like to ask Professor Uysal to direct the panel discussion. We have some questions in the chat, and some of them are directed to our speakers directly. Professor Uysal, the panel is yours.
Thank you, Kazem. I hope you all enjoyed the video. I did again. Looking at the chat and some of the questions posed by our great panelists, maybe I have like 4 or 5 questions. I don't know who I should direct these questions to, but I think maybe one of the questions we can focus on is that clarification between, let's say, subjective versus objective quality of life indicators. So this is a measurement issue, and are they distinct? Maybe this is for Joe, or do they overlap somehow? And then I know Tuko spent quality time on that a little bit in his research, and maybe Joe, you can just take this question, and then Tuko maybe weigh in on this. So what are we talking about here when we say objective versus subjective quality of life indicators or measures? I think within the context of maybe just community development and community tourism.
Right, and definitely Tico can weigh in on this, given his research on with the Human Development Index. So a good way to actually look at objective indicators of quality of life in the context of a community or a state or a nation is to focus on what we call objective indicators as captured by the United Nations Development Program Human Development Index, based on what Tico was talking about as the capability approach by Professor Emerita Sen. And this particular approach, objective indicators of quality of life as captured by the Human Development Index, is broken down by education. You got education as indicator. So the idea is that quality of life of people in a community would be high if the education level is high. And a measure of education would be something like the extent to which most of the people within that community have achieved a certain level of educational attainment. Like, you know, the more educated, the higher the quality of life. Another one would be economics. And in terms of the economic well-being, typically, at least from the, if you're doing it at the country level, it's usually something to do with the gross national product. But at the community level, you can talk about household income. So those people who have, if the majority of the people in the community have a higher level of economic well-being, that means they have more income.
Health.
Yeah. Huh? Say it
Health.
again? Health, yeah.
Health.
You know, I almost lost it for a second. At the national level, we usually talk about health as in terms of life expectancy, captured again by the Human Development Index, but at least at the community level, you can talk about, for example, absence of disease or disease incidence. You can capture that at the community level. So these are objective indicators of community quality of life, and which would be very different from subjective indicators. The subjective indicators would be, as we mentioned, it's based on the psychology of well-being, as in life satisfaction, as in positive affect or positive feelings or emotions, and as we talked about in terms of psychological well-being and psychological well-being as captured in terms of what we call eudaimonic well-being. So there should be overlap between objective indicators of quality of life and subjective indicators of quality of life, but not necessarily so. There's so many mediators, so many moderators that kind of, you know, help us understand the relationship or the link between subjective and objective indicators of quality of life. And this is a topic that can be very complex, and and there's no way we'd be able to get into it in at least in the context of this panel. But if you're interested, contact, you know, send me an email message and I can send you a bunch of references related to that topic.
Muzo, I just want to add to what Professor Sergi mentioned is in the public policy area. If you have, I mean, if you only look at the subjective well-being, and for example, if I take Paraguay as an example, where it's the happiest country in the world, while objectively they are the second poorest in Latin America, a pervert politician or legislator would say, well, you guys are saying you're happy. Why should I care to provide you with hospitals, better schools, et cetera, et cetera? So that's why it's so important to look at how close these two are together and try to find out why there is a disconnect, or in order to, you know, to come up with the policies that you would need in order to, you know, really help people in their objective, in their living conditions as well, which is very, very important.
The other question I think several people have been talking about is the notion of phases of tourism development. I guess you all alluded to this, Stefan and Heather and Tukro, you. Of course, destinations go through different phases of development. So meaning level of development then may serve as a moderating variable. And I see the chat, and then the question is, how would that affect, let's say, quality of life measures, or let's say reactions coming from different stakeholders, whether it be residents or tourists? Because if the destination is in the beginning of development, then someone even mentioned in the chat the irradiation model, which assumes linear development of behavioral responses, unlike anytime anyone can have some sort of reaction to types of development we experience in a given destination. So you don't have to reach maturity, to get irritated, right? So that being said, so the question to the panel, and I guess Stefan or Heather could take on this. How would that level of development influence, let's say, policies or the way we do research or understand, let's say, quality of life issues as they relate to community residents? So is that so important? If so, how would that be possible? Because Tico was referring to, remember, types of countries. So meaning they are really on different levels of development. A country is going through some sort of transition. The other is more of an established country versus someone that is a country that is developing, right? And then so even just having these beautiful arts and festivals may be appealing to our higher order needs, may take place in a more refined city environment than, you have some other events, right, unique to that development. So anyway, I'm throwing that out because the discussion is going on in the chat. So let's talk about phases of development and how they influence what we do, meaning quality of life research at the community level. Either Heather, you take this, and then Stefan, whoever wants to go first, welcome to do so.
You're muted.
Yeah, I was gonna, I saw Stefan wasn't, but I'll have a little go. In the chat, I did see Professor App has actually responded to, I would say, I'll concur with some of what he's talking about. Because I was thinking also, Ella, about Doxy's iridex, and that's something that is a concept that's been way back in time that we forget about sometimes. And then I start thinking about Tico's findings and how there really is a heterogeneity about how communities react. And then Tico, I think about Orlando, and I think about, as a mature destination. And just this week, I was showing my students some historical video of when Disney first opened, and there were 30-mile tailbacks on the roads. And so the residents were very angry, and they're still angry today with Interstate 4 at different times of the day. So that does make policy very difficult. But I also think there are some standardized, responses that communities seem to have. And this is where I go back with Professor Abt to Dogan's classic article about how communities can respond to these outside forces that then gradually become part of the community. And so if I think about Orlando, I can really see that idea of boundary maintenance, where you can go into communities where in Orlando, where you wouldn't even know that Disney is down the road. And I think about even Gainesville, Florida, and for us, obviously in the fall semester, big events like football. Last weekend, 85,000 people in the stadium of a community the size of 140,000. That's huge, huge impact. But again, boundary maintenance, because if you come to a certain part of town, you wouldn't even know that it's going on. So I really do think that we go back to, and I do some work with Gianna Moscato down at James Cook University, because she works with our study abroad programs. And she always teaches our students that, just like I was saying, that events, tourism are part of the overall community. And so what we need to think about is, how does hosting an event, how does being a tourism destination fit with the other parts of the community? And so therefore, policy-wide, I think what we've done traditionally is think about subsectors, when in fact we should be thinking about community policy, of which event development or tourism development is part of what we talked about with the objective indicators, education in the community, recreational facilities, health facilities, and so that we come to the table together and develop a community plan. And that community plan can then be tailored to the community in terms of how do we maximize quality of life for the community, and how do we maximize quality of life for the tourists that are actually coming in. So those would be some of my thoughts. Stefan.
I think that tourism development is actually taking quite momentum within South Africa, and that because everybody experienced actually the benefits from that. But it also let me think of the life cycle model of Butler as an example. Where are we now and where are we moving in that? Because there is different perceptions between rural communities and urban communities, how they perceive actually tourism and that, because there is less infrastructure in some of the informal communities than urban communities as such and that. So actually getting those individuals to understand how to improve their quality of life, and that seems to be a challenge in that. And also, also the Iridex model is actually coming forward as such, and that because if you do not understand tourism as such and do not understand the benefits of tourism and that, then irritation might be higher than the rest and that. So this is what I could say about the discussion so far.
Tuko, would you like to add anything to this discussion at this point?
Yes, what I would like to say is one way to look at it is, for example, what we found in one of our studies is, for example, that social comparison, what it leads is, for example, you have a kind of correlation with people sleeping less and people having less time. So what it means is that they want to consume more, and so therefore they don't sleep well, they don't spend enough time with their family or with their neighborhood and so forth. So that could be an indication. If you find that correlation in your study, it could be an indication that you're getting to a point where it's really, showing some deterioration signs, and that you have to, tackle as community or as part of the public policy. So there is something that we clearly found in several of our studies where there is particular correlation between the two. I cannot hear you. I cannot.
Just to add to this discussion, I also see something about this again in the chat. I was thinking about having some sort of a threshold. Is it possible for us to, Stefan talked about, slow tourism, at what point, we as community make a decision, let's say not to grow, or just say, is there a threshold thereafter, we're gonna see some sort of deterioration of quality of life locals, so that, it's a capacity issue, right, Heather, as we're referring to, and how do you measure that? Is 10,000 enough to maintain that level of quality of life as set or desired by locals, or should we just go with 20,000, right? There is that issue of threshold, and Bassos made a good point. He said, I'm going to read his question. Question to all panelists. In a setting where tourism functions as community quality enhancer, what would be the first signs pointing to a deterioration of this? So I guess he implies that there has to be some threshold of development. And we've seen so many different places in the USA all over, right? So you go in and go out and you just you don't really just a place that has lost its local identity, right? And sense of place, etc. Just a highly commodified product, right? In and out type. And then, yes, I've been there, but locals, and Jafari will speak to it well, really are irritated to the extent that they don't want to see any more visitors in June. Like you look at a place like Hilton Head Island, right? Or Myrtle Beach in South Carolina, you have limited access to it, and locals are not as happy with the people who come in. I know this from Venice, talking to some of our colleagues, and locals who have probably moved out long time ago living on the second floor as these beautiful gift shops are not as happy with those people day and night. And there are some local restrictions as to how late they can open, right? So that you cut down noise. So the point is, I mean, is there a threshold that we can maintain, meaning maintaining our level of quality of life as we define? You look at the slow tourism concept, right? That is based on that premise that locals should have a saying in that development process. A good example is you look at Bellinzona in Switzerland, right? The capital of Ticino canton. I mean, that's how they manage their influx of visitors to some extent, or level of development, so that they can maintain their quality of life, however they may define that based on objective or subjective indicators. But I'm just throwing this out, maybe even including our distinguished scholar, Professor Jafari, if you may want to just weigh in on this as well. Like, that threshold issue is a big issue, capacity issue. How do you maintain the psychologically, physically, and socially? So can you hear me?
No, the microphone wasn't coming on. Yes, I did. Thank you very much. There are many ways of looking at this, and today we were sometimes talking about individual. Well, let me first say the keywords we have been using: quality of life, and it was mentioned a number of times. Happiness, satisfaction, and well-being. These are the keywords we use today every time. But sometimes I think we were zigzagging between individual happiness, satisfaction, quality of life, and community, group. That is very important to acknowledge. I don't want to talk to any panelists as such, refer to any comments of the panelists. So let me go to something neutral, which is the video. The video was talking about individual happiness. Do what you wish. Enjoy what you like. But wait, if what I do and I like, when I do it, my community doesn't like that, now what's going to do? So we have to make this huge distinction between individual happiness and community happiness. Let's connect this to the reality of today, COVID-19. My neighbors, and there are many of them, they would be very happy not to wear the mask and go outside. And then there are those who would be disturbed. So how do we measure this, just this little factor? How do we measure happiness here? What do we do? Going to tourism, there are communities, members who don't like tourism, and those who love to have tourism. So again, we have this situation going on. So I wanted to make this point, plus the fact, I want to add the point that the models that we talk about are often Western models of happiness, measurement of happiness, well-being, etc., etc. Just for the sake of argument, in Western sense, maybe happiness is something external. We show it, we reveal it. In many developing countries, people don't reveal it. Happiness is internal, it's personal. So how do we bring these issues to the concept of happiness? Individual, community, culture, developing countries, different cultures. I mean, I was listening to all of you, and the word culture was not even mentioned once, while community is defined by culture. So these are the points I wanted to add, and I hope my colleagues would like to comment on that.
It's open to all of you. I think a great points, and just maybe I can make a brief statement how true it is. You're right, to look at destinations, that's an amalgamation of different cultures. So if you ignore cultural uniqueness of a given place, then you won't be able to really just address some of these issues in a way that will allow us to contextualize the setting, because to me, context is extremely important for a destination. Absolutely, know the nature of that destination, as well as know the level of development they are going through. Also, the social psychological structure of that place, because that has to be. So it's a really well said, good point. And I don't know, anyone else want to just chime in? Maybe Heather, you were just shaking your heads, and would you comment?
For me, you know, absolutely, cultural context is very, very crucial. And I think with some of the initial questions that we asked, which is, you know, at what point can we see if a community is about to maybe tip over into the threshold? That's the word that I was looking for. Perhaps we actually then go into some of our colleagues that are in natural resource settings. They've been doing this for years with concepts such as social carrying capacity, which is absolutely culturally contextual because it's based on non-referencing, physical carrying capacity. And then, you know, the ideas related, I think, Muso, you were starting to go that way with place identity. And those are concepts that have been used for years in wilderness management. And so if we start, I think, and I've been trying to do this for years, trying to be much more multidisciplinary and actually look at what everybody who are working on related issues, we actually then reach out and look at some of those concepts to see how they might be used. And in fact, they have been used in some tourism research. So then that gets to, I think, Jafar, where you were going in terms of there is a difference absolutely between the individual aspect of happiness or life satisfaction, but it's also related to the community as a whole. And it brings me back to, you know, thinking about classic ideas about the commons and the common good, and how does that individual life satisfaction relate to the common good. And I think that's where we may have lost our way a little bit in the West more recently, where the focus has been much more individualistic. When Muso, you asked me about the girlfriend getaways work, and I think about, you know, what some of the Asian scholars, particularly the writers from China, have brought to us is that the girlfriend getaways are seen in a very different way from the Western women. And there's a paper right now that I've been working with for Annals, which looks at this concept of intimacy. And the intimacy is very different to what we found with US women, but it's also related to the bonding and the experience that these women have, which then goes back to their everyday lives and how they work with their families and how they work with their communities. So I think, yeah, we do need to think about bringing the two sides together, and that focus on where does community intersect with the individual in terms of whatever concept we're using, because we have been using things interchangeably: well-being, quality of life, satisfaction. And I think we also need to untangle those as well.
Yes, I'm also from a point of view in that different cultures perceive quality of life differently. And especially within the tourism context and that. So this is something that we need to revisit basically again, and that, you know, focusing on a proper understanding actually of terminology associated with quality of life itself, and that, because what quality of life might mean to me might not be to another person, and that. And this is very important, where culture becomes a challenge actually residing in different communities as such, and that. So this is something that researchers need to look at basically, and that is actually to make sure that the culture that you are actually doing your research with, residing in that community, and that do understand what you are trying to bring across.
I think that it doesn't matter the culture, in the sense that if you don't have food on the table, whether you're Eastern or Western or wherever you're coming from, that's the issue. So tourism is a tool in order to help put food on the table. And then as you reach a certain level, then you change. And then culture might come into play, how you for example, how individualistic you are or less. And there is, I mean, basically there is this tendency as you become wealthier or more affluent as a family or as a person, that you become more individualistic and you think less in terms of others, in terms of the externality that you can bring about. But I mean, I think, at least from my perspective, where I'm working, especially with poor people, that is the main thing that I've been hearing from them. You know, I need to have food on the table, and that is what determines how rational I am in terms of sending my kids to schools, sending them to hospitals, or to get the vaccine or whatever, because they need to work in order to get food on the table.
Nice said. I think this points out one thing that is so important. The context in which we do our research has to be understood and well understood, because that's what this is all about to me, because not every place will be the same, and there's a high degree of heterogeneity, and then we need to take that into account so that, you know, we can make appropriate implications. Speaking of some of these methodological issues, I was also thinking about another area in terms of like generating our data for this type of research. I guess, you know, TUCO maybe, you know, may have done some survey or mostly use maybe a time series or longitudinal data. Some of the things we see, you know, mostly rely on cross-sectional data that is generated at one point in time. We don't really get into longitudinal studies, even if I see in the chat a lot of other colleagues in different countries in Spain, Portugal, Europe, and OECD, you know, I mean, they monitor some of this, right? They seem to do good surveys at the local level, regional or state level. But the issue is how do you go about generating appropriate data for your research or topic of interest, right? But as I said, we lack maybe longitudinal studies, but mostly rely on, let's say, you know, already collected, you know, data sources, secondary over time, which is good, maybe to use to do some sort of objective, based on objective quality of life indicators, because relying on secondary data, more quantifiable, measurable, that will be available to us. But once you get into subjective issues, even if there is some overlap, you can ask people, okay, how do they perceive this tangibilized aspect of quality of life indicators? That's one thing, but the reality, yeah, right, having that food on the table is a different measure, which is much easier. So the question to me is like, when we do our research, right, I was trying to figure out if there is any overlap between subjective, objective measures in the same research setting. Okay, that's one. Or should we also try to do longitudinal studies over time to monitor like change, so that we can understand how locals may respond to these physical changes to the structure of that destination over time, meaning their behavioral responses to it. So I think that kind of monitoring is extremely important. If you could, any of you speak to this, let's say like longitudinal type work and or just you know, secondary data sources using time series to understand, let's say, quality of life indicators, etc.
Well, I can, I think, address something. I mean, these are very interesting points and definitely thought-provoking. The whole idea of culture, the whole idea of carrying capacity, bringing in models from sociology, from ecology to capture those. But you know, going back to Muzo's idea of longitudinal research, I think much of that can be captured at the psychological level. And let's say, for example, if we're talking about how residents perceive the impact of tourism in different life domains, and if you'd be able to conduct a longitudinal survey to essentially capture those perceptions in the context of cultural life, in the context of social life, family life, leisure life, and so forth, economic life or financial well-being. And if you'd be able to do that, then, and you do this over time, you'd be able to see how these perceptions have changed in the context of a given community. And by doing so, you'd be able to figure out exactly whether you you have exceeded a certain threshold, maybe in economic well-being in the context of social well-being, and once you be able to identify that threshold in the context of the residents' perceptions, in the context of those different social domains, the public policy implications are pretty obvious at that point, because if we're talking about environmental degradation, and if most of the residents would be able to see that and feel pretty bad about it, then the public policy implication in relation to the environmental infrastructure would be very evident. You need to do something about it, and therefore you'd be able to develop some very specific policies in relation to those different issues. So from a psychological point of view, you'd be able to capture much of that and translate these longitudinal findings into concrete public policies.
Just to follow up on this, so what is then this was also brought up in our chat, what is the role of our industry? I mean, how do you bring industry leaders into this dialogue so that you can have a high level of dialogue, conversation? Because up until now, we as academicians, right, just talking and have been producing research, maybe working with locals and consultants and decision makers, but at what point or how should we bring industrial leaders in this high-level conversation we're having about, let's say, community tourism development and quality of life, I guess, seeking partnership, etc. So Paul Rogers, did make a good point in the chat. He says we do, get together with all these people to talk about quality of life issues. So at this time, looking at our panels, maybe we should have thought about this. We don't have anyone, right, representing, let's say, stakeholders, meaning a community leader or industry person, right? So the question to us, how would you encourage us to have that kind of partnership into community leaders so that, what we do becomes more meaningful, acceptable to policymakers or decision makers?
I think one way that one can actually share your research is actually sharing it with local, sharing it with local newspapers and that, so that you can actually get communities actually to read that. Because it often feels to me, or I experience that when you engage with community leaders and that your research result stops with them and one is not sure how that gets communicated to the community as such. So we need to come up with innovative ways, actually sharing with the community itself who's actually participating in your research as such.
If I may add, I agree with you, Stefan, but one of the things we need to do is to speak the language of the industry. We do not. We speak the language of research, academics. A term that we should have used today and we did not is hospitality. We were talking about hospitality. So how does quality of life, satisfaction, etc., lead into hospitality? Without hospitality, there is no tourism. The quality of life and other measurements have to somehow translate into hospitality, the spirit of hospitality. Without the spirit of hospitality, tourism has no spirit. It goes nowhere.
Jafar, if I may, hospitality is a very American word. You go to Latin America, they don't know what it means. They talk about hoteleria. They don't talk about hospitality. So there is your culture, aspect to that. What I think is important is, from my perspective, is we have to change how our elected leaders measure success. For example, right now, we look at the World Tourism Organization. It is about arrivals and receipts. There is no quality of life involved. And of course, if you don't have that, that doesn't impact the leaders of the hospitality of tourism industry. So because that is very, very important. It is how do we measure? Somebody in the I saw in the chat mentioned that about the happiness index. Perhaps that should be one of the third pillar, how we measure, the whole performance in a more comprehensive way. So that is crucial. I think, Jafar, we had this conversation before in Palma de Mallorca a few years back, where people only look at these two indicators instead of a more holistic way of measuring success and get to these important issues.
And that's a good point. Just to add to this, we have done a lot of discussion about, let's say, sustainability indicators, quality of life indicators, but rarely have we done much in terms of connecting those indicators to, let's say, performance measures. However, those performance measures may be measured, let's say, the bottom line, or just, even your share price and or your profitability, or, RevPAR, any measure that you can use. So I think we have more talk about like conceptualizing, laying out these indicators, but in real life, we have less work that connects these indicators back to performance measures as outcome measures, whether at the individual level satisfaction, which we understand, at the maybe management level, maybe loyalty, etc. But more importantly, on a macro level, how are they connected to the success of a destination? So that's another line of research that needs further investigation, no question. Maybe at this time, I see a lot of specific questions, and maybe I can pick one of them. And then Dory made a point that, maybe this goes back to you, Joe, like going through longitudinal studies may, contradict, let's say, your regular research productivity, because it takes a lot of time, and yet, we're under pressure maybe in academia to publish, produce, and that is true but as a research unit, I think you can maintain some sort of visibility by creating that kind of knowledge coming out of it consistently over time. That gives you much longer, better visibility for the institution than, maybe you will get individually. So the question would be, like longitudinal versus cross-sectional, or just quick, doesn't take a lot of time, so you can get something out in publication. Is that a valid argument or not? But I just mentioned because someone brought that up in the chat. Joe, what do you think? Just what is the trade-off, I guess, as a researcher, right? Someone who is a PhD or just, ready to go out and initiate something longitudinal, and yet the pressure is something else, in academia.
Yeah.
Then I will turn it to Kazim. Maybe we will just see what else we have in the chat to continue with our discussion. Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah. Our job as academics is to be able to produce the kinds of models, theoretical models, and validate those models based on good research, setting the foundation for practitioners to be able to use those models in a way that would ultimately create an impact. So, as academics, I don't think we can do it on our own. We have to team up with practitioners we're talking about longitudinal research in every community. If let's say the model that I was talking about, and that's also partly Muzo's model too, is based on capturing residents' perceptions of tourism development in these different life domains, then the practitioners can take this model and take the measures that are embedded in this model and apply it to their community and monitor the level of quality of life in those, in relation to those specific life domains, and be able to translate the findings, the study findings, in terms of something very tangible in terms of public policies, or as Jafar is talking about, in terms of managerial policies related to the hospitality industry. We need to team up with the practitioners. We can't do it at all. And the practitioners need to team up with the academics that do this kind of research so that they would be able to do it in a credible and valid way.
Thank you, Joe. Great. Hopefully it will help our colleagues and friends. And there's a lot of question about the measurement issues, but let's just turn the panel back to Kazim. And so would you like to zero in on specific questions, Kazim, in our chat so that our panel could respond?
Thank you.
To?
Yes, thank you, Muzo. I'm learning a lot, and I there are a lot of questions directly to me. And if I summarize some of them and I add some to this, and if I can add some this question in this way, a lot of questions goes to the presentation by Tico and Joseph. You mentioned about economic, social, cultural, and environmental capitals, let's say, or resources, and in the other hand, the sense of material well-being on social and cultural or environmental well-being. So one issue is how we can measure the change of people's satisfaction or their point of view toward these sense of well-being. For example, culture is changing, social capital is changing, environmental resources or the quality of environmental resources. So how we can trace this or measure it over the time? Maybe something that were satisfying people a decade before is not, or the values change and so on. And as Tico mentioned, poor are happy, and some maybe developed countries with more wealth, they're unhappy. So can you elaborate some on the time perspectives of satisfaction?
Tico, you want to go first?
On a time series perspective, also panel perspective, we have done, we took the time dimension into consideration for especially objective, when we look at objective well-being using Human Development Index and also Human Development Index Plus. And of course, you see that it changes over time, and the relationship between tourism development and well-being changes. As we said, there are thresholds, and we can measure that threshold exactly, for example, by looking at the amount of income per capita, at what level does it change, for example, in order to get an idea. And then we can, in some studies, we have gone to quintiles to look at within a country itself. So not only between countries, but also within. The other thing is the only study that we did from a subjective well-being is in the case of Aruba, where we have looked at 2011, 2015, 2017, having the same type of questions and looking at, not the same people, but using a representative sample. We are waiting right now because of COVID to see how that impacts, and I think we will do something next year in order to see that evolvement over time. But what we have seen clearly pre-COVID over these three subjective, with three surveys actually, we have seen that the relationship between tourism development and well-being has disappeared completely, because it does not exist between the two. But what is very, very important is it starts, so the direct relationship. The indirect is going very much towards the word opportunities and also social comparison, especially, again, the question of inequality. That is what is becoming stronger, and that affects how people perceive tourism. Because if you look at the four dimensions that Professor Surgeon mentioned, they of course they have different weight and they cancel each other out. So that's also very important to look at. So I may say that I'm very much against the way tourism is developing from a social or environmental perspective, but if I weigh the material perspective stronger, that cancel out the other two and still have a positive impact on how I see well-being in general, about my well-being. So these things we are getting a better sense of what's going on internally when we look at these different domains.
Okay, well said. Let me go back to this. This is, again, a slide that I showed. And as I mentioned, that this model has been validated. So we know that this model works because we've got much data that substantiates this model. Now, what Kazim was saying is that we need to measure the sense of material well-being and the sense of social well-being and cultural well-being, environmental well-being in the context of community. No, you don't need to do that. This model is already validated. The only thing that you need to do in the context of a given community, the hospitality and the tourism industry operators have to measure continuously these constructs right on the left-hand side of the model. Perceived tourism economic impact, perceived tourism social impact, perceived tourism cultural impact, and the same thing with environmental impact. These are the things that needs to be measured continuously and to monitor, again, the quality of life through these constructs. You don't need to measure these things, the other things, which is the sense of material well-being. You don't need to measure social well-being and cultural well-being and so forth. You don't need even to measure life satisfaction because the model is already validated. So from a practical public policy or managerial perspective, all you need to do is measure continuously the health of and quality of life in a given community through, again, the perception of tourism impact of these different life domains: economic, social, cultural, and environmental. That's what you need to do if you buy into this model.
Thank you so much, Joseph. I do believe so because I work with sustainable livelihood model and it has a pretty similar concept. There are a few questions to Heather, if you let me talk about or take the discussion to the events. And events are usually seasonal and they overuse some of the resources or the capacity of the community. So how this paradox with quality of life and event and how you advise to manage the events to benefit the community and increase the quality of life. I would like to hear your answer first. And I have one example myself from some communities in Italy that I want to share after your comment. Heather, please.
Yeah, thank you. I think this goes back to some of the concepts that I was sharing with you. So one of the ways that has been put forward to manage a community in terms of the types of events it's hosting, to be able to look at event hosting as a community endeavor rather than what typically happens, which is the arts community will host over here and the music community might host here and the sports community, and there's no real coordination. And so one of the concepts that's been put forward is borrowing from business studies is the idea of developing an event portfolio for the community. Because since the early days of, coming through the 2000s into the 2010s, as more and more communities have actually gone from hosting events for themselves, because that's something that we should also remember, is that when we were talking about festivals and events, oftentimes it was for the local community. And then gradually through time, we then looked at them as a tourism product. And that's where we are today. And so we've still got to manage, just like any other community activity, the locals, in many respects, still see the event for them, and as well as now being a tourism generator. And so going back to that idea of the event portfolio, we can actually then, if we bring the different community stakeholders together who are hosting different events and have, in the broadest sense, a calendar that says, okay, this event is here, this one's here, this one's here, because we've also used events to manage seasonality. That's another aspect within community life that we've done. And then within that event portfolio, it's not just about making sure that events don't cannibalize each other, but we've got other aspects that directly relate to quality of life. Volunteers. Without a volunteer force, you're not going to host an event because we just don't have the workforce. Yet we were getting into stages where event volunteering, they were getting burned out because there were too many events. So that would be something to be managing. Issues related to what I've said before, where an event may make changes within the community, such as closing off the roads, problematic. I mean, I've seen that with some marathons, where there's been local people that have driven through the marathon because they were mad that the road was closed off for yet another weekend. So that's the things that we've got to think about in relation to that. I think that we've got to be much more community focused, just like I said, in terms of being community focused within tourism, that the local people are, not only are we mindful of the local people, but the local people are involved also in some of the decision making, and the different community event hosters are also working with each other as well. Does that help a little?
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much. And if I may add my experience with the small community in Italy, I've been taking my students for a few years continuously to a small lake in north of Rome, which is called Lake Bracciano. And the initiative of this small village around the lake was really interesting to see that the event or the festival was on a boat and in the lake. But each community was utilizing this event from their own way and how they could benefit from their own resources. One side we have the famous Bracciano Castle that Tom Cruise got married there, and they have branding and this wedding ceremonies and so on, watching that firework in the boat in the lake. The other side, they had their second homeowners who are their main houses in Rome, and they're living there and watching. And in some other communities, they were organizing food festivals. So there different communities, they were utilizing the same event in several ways. So I usually, when I talk to my students as a workshop activity, see how the local initiative can utilize the functionality of event. And your explanation is wonderful. And I was just wondering if this could be a complementary kind of a workshop activity or comment that people from the same or within the same community can utilize the event with their own perspective. And I think you might agree with this. Thank you, Heather. And my last question is to Stefan, if I may, about your important view and the stakeholders. So one important aspect of stakeholders is to build trust, to work together. And this is a social capital, I can say. So there is also a certain level of, or a need for trust each other and working together for a better well-being. And for well-being, they need to work together and trust each other to work. So how it can be built, how the community can capitalize on this social capital and bring this stakeholder management for a better well-being. What is your advice?
I think cultural differences are there basically in that, but social cohesion could bring about community pride as such, and that could greatly assist actually improving the quality of life of various tourist host communities as such. So this is what I would like to bring about, and that's a social cohesion is an important factor.
Great, thank you. I think I would like to pass the floor to Professor Jafari, as this is our custom again for the final conclusion or final remark. And we are pretty behind the time schedule. Professor Jafari, please enlighten us with your final conclusion remarks.
Well, you're giving me a task which is impossible to accomplish. The discussion has been great, and it somehow it seems to me that this is the beginning of discussion. We just opened a few ideas. We have to put them back together. But if I may go beyond this, the theme of this conference, this webinar, and go to the series that we are doing, and going to we academicians and the industry on the other hand, I want to say that the audience we had today most probably would enjoy benefited from our discussion, because we were discussing this more academically rather than practically. Joe, you said we need the industry and academia can come together. Well, we all agree. It hasn't happened. It hasn't happened, and I don't know who's going to build the bridge, but there is no bridge of communication. So we are basically, we people, again, this is not the theme of this webinar, and it's not a commentary on this webinar. It's a larger mission I'm talking about. We have to find ways of communicating our knowledge, intelligence with the industry. We don't know the language of communication for the industry. We have ended up talking to ourselves, and I can document this with my example. When Annals of Tourism Research began, it was the 3rd journal in the field. We have now over 400 journals. Who's reading this? Academicians. We are talking to each other, quoting each other, etc., etc., etc. So Joe, the bridge needs to be built, but it's not built. And I think we academicians have to do something about it. You know, the industry was paralyzed is paralyzed during the COVID-19. Did we have any advice? All this research we have done, they did not come to us, and we did not go to them. And we had all this knowledge. So again, this is not this webinar, it's just a general thing, general comment I would like to make, that we have succeeded academically in tourism, but not transferring our knowledge to the fields of practice. And I really hope we give more attention to this as professors, prepare our students for the industry, for not becoming another professor. We have enough of them getting PhDs and becoming professors. So that's my Qasim, that's my comment, which is beyond the subject of this webinar. It connects to the webinar series. It connects us to academia, and it should connect academia to the industry. And I give ourselves a bad grade when it comes to connecting the academic and industry banks. They are not connected, and we are not talking to each other.
Thank you, Jafar. Actually, SCoT team have summarized your idea, and our first report or annual report of SCoT is coming out soon. And we are going to send it to all our participants and see how SCoT did its own share of bridging theory and practice in the field. I think we did a bit of good work right after pandemic, and we can ask our audience to wait for a few more weeks until we publish the first report. Time is passed. A very special thank goes to Dr. Ursal for the wonderful event and beautiful architect of this event, and all speakers that they talked the same thing in different ways, and I could trace how they beautifully are linked together. And I got some comments from some of our loyal followers that this was one of the webinars that they didn't realize how the time passed. So thank you very much again, and we hope to host you again in another webinar of SCoTs. Thanks a lot, and have a good morning and good evening all. Thank you very much.
And I add my thanks to Mozo and to the panelists and to the people who stayed with us all the way to the end of the webinar. Thank you very much, you all. We together did a wonderful webinar. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kazim. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, Musa. Bye-bye, Heather. Bye-bye, Jafar. Bye-bye, Joe.
Bye. Thank you.